Today, you will hear the story of Delia and Jim, a couple who had it all, except for enough. In a Christmas marked by sacrifice, they will each do something that tests love beyond the imaginable. But what they discover is not in the gifts, but in what they lose. Are you ready? Delia let the last bill fall onto the table and began counting the coins with trembling fingers. 1, 2, 3, until she reached a humiliating total, $1.87. Seeing the sum, she felt something inside her break. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to stop the tears that struggled to fall, but it was useless. A warm drop fell onto the table, lost among the dull shine of the coins. Christmas was just around the corner, and with that pittance, she couldn't buy anything for Jim. Nothing worthy of him. The apartment they shared was a modest refuge, but it pained Delia that, despite all the love it held, its peeling walls and worn furniture seemed to scream the hardships they faced. From the small window beside the table, she could see the snowflakes falling over the city. Every time the cold wind made the glass creak, her mind returned to the same question. How could she make this Christmas special for him? Jim was everything to her. No matter how little they had, he always found a way to make her smile after a difficult day. Whether it was with a clumsy joke or a simple hug, he was her anchor. His gold watch, though worn, was a symbol of the stories he shared about his grandfather and father, a legacy Jim carried with pride. Delia, on her part, had always taken care of her golden hair, long as a river of light, cascading down to her knees. Jim often joked that her hair shone brighter than any star in the winter sky. That morning, Delia looked at herself in the old mirror of the bedroom. The crack that ran across the glass seemed to split her reflection in two. Her hair was tied back in a braid that reached her back, but when she let it down, the golden waves fell like a torrent. Her fingers traced the strands carefully, as if caressing a fragile treasure. It was beautiful, yes, but what was it worth? Her mind toyed with an idea she didn't want to accept. She tied her hair back again and walked away from the mirror, but the seed had already been planted. The day passed in a mechanical routine. She washed the dishes, prepared tea, and folded the clean sheets. Everything seemed the same, yet there was a weight in the air that she couldn't ignore. When Jim arrived that evening, exhausted but with a smile on his face, Delia made an effort to hide her concern. She watched him as he placed his worn coat on the chair and took out his watch to set it on the mantelpiece. The gesture, so ordinary, made Delia's heart ache. That watch, the only luxury Jim possessed, seemed to shine with an even greater significance that night. As they prepared for bed, Delia couldn't help but look at him. Jim, with his eyes closed and breathing deeply, seemed at peace, unaware of the thoughts invading her mind. She knew she would do whatever it took to see him happy, even if it meant letting go of what she valued most. The sun had barely begun to rise between the gray buildings when Delia pulled on her worn coat and stepped out into the cold street. The wind cut like knives, but she hardly felt it. Her mind was fixed on a thought that had grown into a storm since the night before. Jim did not deserve another Christmas without magic. Her steps echoed on the pavement, accompanied by the faint jingling of the coins in her pocket. The market was full of life, a vibrant contrast to the city's melancholy. Vendors shouted offers, children ran between the stalls, and twinkling lights adorned the storefronts. Delia walked slowly, observing each shop carefully. In every corner there seemed to be something that could make Jim happy. A wool vest, an elegant hat, an engraved mug. But everything was beyond her reach. Even the humblest options cruelly exceeded the limits of her savings. Finally, something caught her eye. A platinum chain resting delicately on a red velvet cloth in a jewelry store's window. Its simplicity and shine seemed made for Jim's watch, completing the story of generations that the object represented. Delia froze, imagining Jim holding it in his hands, admiring how the chain fit perfectly with his most cherished inheritance. But then, her reflection in the window brought her back to reality. Her tied-up hair peeked out beneath her hat, framing her face so naturally that she hadn't even realized she was staring at herself. In that moment, a bold, painful, and liberating idea crossed her mind. She knew of a hairdresser on a nearby street where Madame Sofronie bought hair like hers to make wigs. Jim deserves something better than an empty Christmas, she thought, her heart pounding. But the idea of parting with her hair, her pride, the jewel that Jim so adored, tied a knot in her stomach. She touched her braid again with trembling fingers, running her hand over it as if bidding farewell to an old friend. It's just hair, she told herself, trying to convince herself. It will grow back. The wind whipped her as she left the market, carrying her doubt away with it. With firmer steps, Delia turned in the direction of the hairdresser, more certain with each step that she was doing the right thing. Jim had worked so hard all year, sacrificing so much for them. Now it was her turn to give him something in return. Something that would remind him how important he was to her, not just on Christmas, but on every single day of their lives together. The door of Madame Sofronie's hair shop opened with a metallic creak that seemed to freeze time. Delia stepped in hesitantly, feeling the contrast between the warm air inside and the icy cold she had just left behind. The place was almost empty, except for the robust figure of the hairdresser, who stood with her back turned, adjusting a mannequin with a curly wig. Madame Sofronie turned when she heard the footsteps. Her gaze was direct and calculating, as if she could measure a person's worth with a single glance. Without a word, she set the mannequin aside and crossed her arms, waiting. Delia swallowed hard, nervously stroking the braid that rested on her shoulder. "I want to sell my hair," she said at last, her voice steadier than she had expected. The woman raised an eyebrow and pointed to a chair beside the mirror without a word. Delia obeyed, letting her braid fall loose, the hair cascading down to her knees. Madame Sofronie approached, her eyes scanning every strand with the precision of a jeweler. Without preamble, she pronounced her verdict. $20. Delia nodded quickly, as though hesitating might cause the offer to change. She sat in the chair, avoiding looking at herself in the mirror as Madame Sofronie took out a pair of enormous scissors. When she felt the first tug, a pang of sadness shot through her. she could almost hear Jim's voice, calling her my golden star as he ran his fingers through her hair. As the scissors did their work, memories flooded Delia. The first time Jim tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the shine in his eyes when she let her hair down for a special occasion, the way he always seemed to find comfort in tangling his fingers in its strands as they rested together. A tear rolled down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. She couldn't allow herself to falter now. Madame Sofronie finished in silence, letting the braid drop onto the counter. Without ceremony, she counted the bills and handed them over. Delia took them with both hands, as though they were a talisman justifying her sacrifice. She stood up, feeling the weight that had disappeared from her head, and how her heart beat with a mixture of emptiness and hope. "Thank you," she said before leaving, though she wasn't sure whom she was thanking. The woman, fate, or herself, for having had the courage. Back out in the cold street, Delia touched her short hair for the first time. It felt strange, but also liberating. She forced herself to think of Jim, of how his face would light up when he received his gift. That image sustained her as she walked toward the jewelry store, clutching the $20 tightly. Delia pressed the bills against her chest as she crossed the street toward the jewelry store. Through the window, she could see the platinum chain resting in its place, as if waiting for her. She entered with determined steps, though a faint uncertainty shone in her gaze. "Good afternoon," she said to the jeweler, an older man with thick glasses who glanced at her over his newspaper. "What can I do for you, miss?" he replied, not entirely taking his eyes off the news. Delia pointed to the chain with a small smile. "I want that chain, please. It's for a gift." The jeweler looked at her carefully for the first time, noticing her freshly cut hair and slightly nervous demeanor. Without saying anything, he nodded, took the chain with care, and placed it on a piece of black velvet. $21. Delia handed over the bills, leaving $1 and a few cents in her pocket. As the jeweler wrapped the chain in delicate paper, her heart pounded. The small box seemed to hold not just the gift, but all the love she felt for Jim. "Thank you," she said, hurrying out with the package tucked safely under her coat. As she made her way home, she felt the furtive glances of passers-by. Some looked at her short hair with curiosity, others with a mix of surprise and disapproval. Though her face flushed with shame, she held her chin high with determination. Each look reminded her of the reason behind her sacrifice, and that made her stronger. In another part of the city, Jim looked at his gold watch for the last time before stepping into a comb shop. The weight of the watch had been a constant in his life, a symbol of his roots and the sacrifice of past generations. But now, as he thought of Delia, he realized there was no possession more valuable than her smile. The shopkeeper, a man with graying hair and a stern demeanor, greeted him with a nod. "Can I help you?" Jim slid the watch onto the counter with deliberate slowness, as though the motion marked the end of an era. "I want to sell it," he said firmly. The man examined the watch, scrutinizing every detail like a jeweler appraising a relic. Finally, He pulled a wad of bills from the drawer and placed them in Jim's hand. "It's a good watch. $40 is a fair price." Jim took the money without hesitation and pointed to a pair of tortoiseshell combs he had seen in the display. They were elegant, finely crafted, perfect for holding the hair he so admired on Delia. "I want those," he said. The shopkeeper wrapped the combs with the same meticulousness he had used to count the bills. As Jim left the store, he immediately noticed the lightness of his pocket. The watch was no longer there, and though its absence left a strange emptiness, the image of Delia opening her gift filled him with a warmth that erased any doubt. On his way home, Jim smiled to himself. He thought of how Christmas would be, of the joy of sharing a special moment with Delia, unaware of the sacrifice she was making at the same time. The apartment was calm, bathed in the soft light of the afternoon filtering through the window. Delia carefully placed the box with the platinum chain on the table and walked to the small mirror in the bedroom. She had avoided looking at herself directly since leaving the hairdresser, but she knew it was inevitable. Taking a deep breath, she stood in front of the cracked mirror. Looking at her reflection, her heart sank. Her short hair revealed a version of herself she barely recognized. Gone were the long, golden waves that Jim used to stroke, and the emptiness she felt in their absence seemed to echo her sacrifice. "It's just hair," she told herself again, like a mantra, but this time the phrase failed to comfort her. She took out the curling tongs she kept in a drawer and lit the small stove to heat them. As she waited, she looked into the mirror again, raising a hand to touch her hair. "What if Jim doesn't find me attractive like this?" she thought. The idea drew a heavy sigh from her, but she forced herself to push it aside. Jim loved her, she knew that, and that was all that should matter. With clumsy movements, she began to shape the short strands. The curling tongs weren't ideal for such short hair, but she persisted, trying to create small curls to soften her appearance. Frustration grew with every failed attempt, but she refused to give up. The sound of the wind rattling the windows filled the room's silence, while her reflection seemed to challenge her with every try. Elsewhere, Jim walked home with the combs tucked into his coat. Despite the cold, he felt a persistent warmth in his chest, a mix of pride and melancholy. His hand, so used to brushing the watch in his pocket, now found itself empty, searching for a weight that was no longer there. He remembered the first time his father had given him the watch, when he was just 15. "This watch has been in our family for 3 generations," he had said. Jim had always seen the watch as a link to his grandfather and father, a connection that anchored him to his roots. Now, that connection had vanished in a matter of minutes, handed over to the shopkeeper in exchange for the combs he imagined adorning Delia's hair. A pang of guilt struck him. What would they think if they knew I sold it? He paused for a moment in the middle of the street, staring at his reflection in the window of a closed shop. But as he imagined Delia's smile, the guilt faded slightly. He knew his sacrifice was not in vain. Delia deserved more than any legacy, and he was willing to give her the best, even if it meant letting go of what was once his greatest pride. Back at the apartment, Delia set down the curling tongs and sat on the bed, exhausted both physically and emotionally. Her hair didn't look as she had hoped, but she had done her best. She stood, smoothing her dress with her hands, and looked at herself in the mirror one last time before forcing a small smile. "Jim loves me," she reminded herself. "That's all that matters." When the apartment door finally opened and she heard Jim's familiar footsteps, her heart began to race. Despite her insecurities, she was ready to face her husband's reaction. After all, she had done everything for him. Christmas Eve had arrived, and though the cold crept through the cracks of the apartment, the space felt warm and welcoming. Delia had done her best with the few resources available. On the table, she laid out their nicest tablecloth, one with slightly frayed edges but still full of charm. She placed 2 small candles she had found at the bottom of a drawer and prepared a simple dinner. Freshly toasted bread, hot soup, and a small slice of cake she had saved for the occasion. As she sliced the bread, her hands trembled slightly, though not from the cold. She felt excited, anxious, with a mixture of joy and nervousness she couldn't control. She glanced at the small box containing the platinum chain resting on the mantel and smiled. She had done the right thing. That gift was a symbol of what Jim meant to her, and she couldn't wait to see the expression on his face. Outside, Jim climbed the building's stairs hurriedly, though he stopped every so often to adjust the small package in his pocket. The combs were carefully wrapped in brown paper and tied with a thin string. He knew it wasn't luxurious wrapping, but what mattered was what lay inside. He imagined Delia opening the package, touching the combs with her delicate fingers, and the thought brought a smile to his face. On the 3rd floor, the old neighbor across the hall greeted him as he descended the stairs, and Jim replied with a nod. He tried to hide the tremor in his hands, but the gleam in his eyes was hard to conceal. The package in his pocket seemed to burn with anticipation. Meanwhile, Delia glanced at the mirror one last time. Her short hair looked neater than she had expected after her effort with the curling tongs. She smoothed her apron and adjusted the folds of her dress. When she heard the familiar footsteps in the hallway, her heart raced. She quickly turned off the stove and walked to the door with a mix of excitement and nervousness. At the door, Jim paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. He ran a hand through his hair, as if to make sure everything was in order, and knocked softly on the wood. When the door opened, Delia's eyes met his. For a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. Jim's warm and sincere smile filled the space, and Delia knew that despite everything, this would be a Christmas they would always remember. The door closed softly behind Jim, but there was something on his face that Delia hadn't expected. He stood still, his gaze fixed on her, his eyes lingering on the short hair framing her face. For a few seconds that felt eternal, he said nothing. The weight of his silence fell over the small apartment like a cold mantle, and Delia's heart began to pound. "Jim," she began, her voice breaking. She took a step toward him, but stopped when she saw his expression. A mix of surprise, confusion, and something she couldn't quite decipher. Doubt began to creep into her mind like a shadow. "What have I done?" she thought desperately. "What happened to your hair?" Jim finally asked, his tone soft but full of disbelief. "I sold it," Delia replied, hurrying to fill the growing silence between them. "I did it for you, Jim. I wanted to give you something special, something you truly deserve." She paused for a moment, searching for the right words, but all she found was the fear that he might be disappointed. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her apron. "It's just hair, isn't it? It will grow back. But this Christmas, I couldn't let you go without something to make you happy." Jim kept looking at her, his eyes moving between her short hair and her face, now streaked with tears Delia tried to hide. She bit her lip, unable to endure his silence another second. "Do you still love me?" she whispered, afraid of the answer. Then, as if something inside him broke, Jim stepped forward and embraced her. He held her tightly, letting out a deep sigh that seemed to release all the tension in the room. "Delia, how could you think something like that would change the way I feel about you?" he said, his voice warm and steady, trembling only slightly. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, a light smile beginning to form on his lips. "There's nothing you could do that would make me love you less." Before Delia could respond, Jim reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. He held it out to her with an expression of tenderness mixed with a hint of irony. "But I think this is going to be a little complicated now," he said with a soft laugh. Still confused, Delia took the package with trembling hands. She opened it slowly, unwrapping the paper to reveal a pair of finely carved tortoiseshell combs, her long-cherished desire. Her mouth fell open in a mix of surprise and wonder, but immediately her gaze returned to Jim. How did you get this?" she asked, though she already guessed the answer. Jim smiled sadly and shrugged. "I sold my watch. I wanted to see you happy." The words hung in the air, filled with love and sacrifice. Delia clutched the combs to her chest, then threw herself into Jim's arms, crying and laughing at the same time. In that moment, they understood that the gifts they had exchanged were far more than objects. They were reflections of their love, of their mutual devotion, and of their willingness to give everything for one another. Delia held the combs in her hands as though they were fragile pieces of glass. Their design was even more beautiful than she remembered. The tortoiseshell gleamed warmly under the candlelight, and the intricate details seemed to tell a story. But despite their beauty, a pang of irony pierced her heart. "Jim," she whispered, looking up at him with a mix of tenderness and sadness. "They're perfect, but I can't use them anymore." Her voice trembled as her fingers traced the delicate edges of the combs. Inside her, a mix of emotions battled. Gratitude for the love reflected in the gift, and a sharp pang of loss as she realized her sacrifice had made enjoying it impossible. Jim, standing in front of her, smiled with a gentleness that calmed her thoughts. There was no trace of regret in his eyes, only love. "I know," he said, shaking his head with a light laugh. "But I wanted you to have something worthy of you. Something to show how beautiful you are, Delia." Delia turned her gaze from the combs and reached for something behind her. With careful hands, she took the small box containing the platinum chain and held it out to Jim. Her fingers trembled as she handed it over. "Then I guess we're even, because this is for you," she said, her voice wavering slightly. Jim took the box and opened it slowly. When he saw the platinum chain, a look of astonishment and understanding lit up his face. He held it carefully, letting it slide through his fingers as if memorizing its texture. Then he looked up at Delia, and the silence that followed felt like a pause in time. "I sold my hair to buy it for you," she finally confessed with a timid smile. Then her expression softened as she saw the way he looked at her. "I thought about how happy it would make you to see your watch with something that did it justice." Jim let out a brief, melancholic laugh and gently closed the box before looking back at her. "And I sold my watch to buy you the combs," he said with a smile that concealed a knot in his throat. The weight of his words filled the room, but not with sadness. They looked at each other, first in silence, and then laughter began to bubble up. A soft, almost incredulous laughter that soon mixed with tears neither of them tried to stop. They laughed at the absurdity, but also at the wonder, at how useless their gifts were, and yet at the profound meaning they carried. Delia took a step toward Jim and, still laughing, wrapped him in a warm embrace. He held her tightly, resting his chin on the top of her head. "We're such fools, aren't we?" she said, her voice trembling between laughter and tears. "The luckiest fools that ever existed," he replied, pulling her a little closer against his chest. In that moment, they understood something that went beyond words. The gifts they had exchanged were not a reflection of what they had lost, but of what they had gained. A love so deep and selfless that it needed no material adornment. Christmas was not in the combs or the chain, but in what they had been willing to give to one another. The small dining table was carefully prepared. The candles flickered softly, casting warm shadows on the walls of the apartment. Delia and Jim sat across from each other, their hands intertwined over the worn tablecloth. Between them, the gifts lay in silence, the carefully wrapped combs and the box containing the platinum chain. They needed no decoration beyond the laughter that still resonated in their hearts. Delia broke the silence first, serving the hot soup into their bowls. The aroma filled the room, and they smiled at each other, sharing a moment of peace after the emotional roller coaster they had just lived through. Despite the simplicity of the meal, the warmth of their love made the food feel like a feast. "You know, I think I'll never forget this Christmas," Delia said, as she broke off a piece of freshly toasted bread. Jim looked at her, his eyes reflecting the soft candlelight. He took a sip of soup before answering, setting the bowl carefully back on the table. "Me neither. Not because of the gifts, but because of what they mean." He reached out a hand to Delia and held hers firmly. "You taught me something tonight." Delia looked at him, intrigued, as their fingers intertwined. "What's that?" Jim smiled and looked her directly in the eyes. "That there's no gift in the world greater than what you mean to me." His words hung in the air, full of sincerity. Delia felt a deep warmth envelop her, more powerful than any blanket or fire. In that instant, she realized her sacrifice had not been in vain. She had given the best of herself, and Jim had received it with all his heart. "I just wanted you to be happy, Jim," she said, her voice trembling, but not with sadness. "You make every day worth it, even the hardest ones." Jim stroked her hand gently, nodding, "And you make this world, with all its shortcomings, perfect for me." They sat in silence for a moment, letting the words fill the space between them. Then, with a small look of complicity, they continued their meal, talking of shared memories, future dreams, of everything and nothing at all. Laughter flowed freely, mingling with the shadows and the light. The gifts remained on the table, useless in their original purpose but imbued with a much deeper meaning. They were symbols of a love that had endured the test of sacrifice, of a bond that needed nothing more to be complete. That night, as the wind blew outside, Delia and Jim felt richer than ever before. Not because of what they had, but because of what they shared, an unshakable certainty that as long as they were together, they would always have what truly mattered. The soft light of a winter morning filtered through the bedroom window, bathing the small apartment in a gentle glow. Delia rose slowly, careful not to make noise so as not to wake Jim. She walked to the cracked mirror, intending to tidy her short hair before starting the day. As she approached, something unusual caught her attention. Stuck to the edge of the mirror was a small folded note written in Jim's familiar handwriting. She picked it up carefully, and as she unfolded it, her heart filled with warmth at the words, "Your smile is the greatest gift." Delia smiled, almost unconsciously, her fingers tracing the letters as if they could directly convey Jim's love to her. Despite the simplicity of the gesture, it was a reminder of how much she meant to him. She tucked the note into her apron pocket, determined to treasure it forever. Since Christmas Eve, Jim had found ways to remind her how much he loved her. He left small notes all over the house, in the cutlery drawer, on the bedside table, even sewn into the seam of the apron she wore while cooking. Each one said something different, but they all carried the same message. "You are my everything." For her part, Delia began to look beyond the small frustrations of daily life. Now, every time she received her wages, she carefully set aside a small amount, hiding it in an old tin she'd kept at the top of the cupboard. Her plan was clear. Someday she would save enough money to buy Jim a watch as beautiful as the one he had sacrificed for her. In the evenings, when they sat together after dinner, they talked about their dreams. Jim shared ideas for improving the apartment, maybe fixing the walls or buying a new tablecloth. Delia, meanwhile, imagined the moment when she could surprise Jim with a watch that reflected not only their past, but also the future they were building together. One afternoon, Jim came home with a small flower wrapped in brown paper, the only one he could find in the midst of the freezing winter. He handed it to Delia without ceremony, smiling as he saw how her eyes lit up with gratitude. "It's not much, but I thought it would make you smile," he said, shrugging. Delia took the flower and placed it in a small glass on the table, her heart full of love. "You always do, Jim. Always." In those days after Christmas, life continued with its usual simplicity. But for them, each small gesture, each word shared, was a reminder that their love was their greatest treasure. As long as they had that, they felt they could face anything the world put before them. Winter continued to wrap the city in its relentless cold, but inside the small apartment, the warmth of Jim and Delia's love kept the space cozy and comforting. The difficulties of daily life hadn't disappeared. Work remained exhausting, money was barely enough, and the everyday challenges persisted. But something in them had changed. They faced everything with renewed strength, with the certainty that together they could overcome anything. One afternoon, as they sat on the sofa sharing a blanket, Jim gently caressed Delia's short hair. She looked at him with a mix of tenderness and amusement. "What are you doing?" she asked with a smile. Jim smiled and let his hand rest on her shoulder. "I'm thinking about how to make your hair as beautiful as it always was," he said, his voice steady, though a playful glint shone in his eyes. "I've heard that special oils are good for strengthening it and helping it grow faster. Maybe we could start using some." Delia laughed, but her laughter was tinged with emotion. Knowing that he thought about something so simple, yet so meaningful to her, filled her heart. "Then I think I'll have to hurry with my plan," she said, leaning toward him. Jim raised an eyebrow, curious. "What plan?" Delia looked into his eyes, her smile turning into an expression of sweet determination. "I'm going to buy you another watch. Not just any watch, Jim, but one worthy of you. It might take a while, but I'll do it. I promise." Jim shook his head gently and took her hands in his. "Delia, you don't need to do that. There's no watch in the world that could mean more to me than what you already give me." "I know," she replied, squeezing his hands tenderly. "But I want to do it. For everything we've shared. For everything you are to me." Jim nodded, understanding that for Delia, it wasn't about the watch itself, but what it represented, a symbol of how deeply they loved each other and the sacrifices they were willing to make for one another. From that day on, both began to approach their lives with renewed energy. Jim found ways to save a little more, even bringing his lunch from home to avoid spending money at the shop. Delia, for her part, worked diligently at every task, with the tin in the cupboard serving as her small reminder of hope. No matter how difficult the path, they now knew they were walking it together. The sacrifices they had made that Christmas had not only strengthened their love, but had also given them a new perspective on life. As long as they were by each other's side, there would always be a reason to keep going, their eyes fixed on the future and their hearts full of hope. The seasons passed, and with them came the challenges of daily life. But Delia and Jim's love remained intact, like a flame that never went out. The combs and the platinum chain stayed carefully tucked away in the small drawer beside the bed, wrapped with care, not as objects to be used, but as reminders of a Christmas that had changed their lives forever. One night, while the snow covered the streets like a white blanket, Delia sat by the window, watching the twinkling Christmas lights decorating the nearby buildings. Jim arrived with 2 cups of hot tea, and they settled onto the sofa, wrapped in a shared blanket. The silence was comfortable, full of understanding. Delia looked at Jim and smiled. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes I think about that Christmas and how we both ended up with gifts we couldn't use." Jim chuckled and took a sip of tea. "I suppose we're just a couple of sentimental fools." "Maybe," Delia admitted, but then her expression grew more serious. "But I also think we were never wiser. We gave the best of ourselves, not for what we could gain, but for what we wanted to give." Jim nodded, setting his cup on the table to take Delia's hand. "Exactly. That's what matters. Not the gifts, but the love behind them." The silence filled them again, this time accompanied by the soft crunch of snow under the footsteps of a passerby outside. Finally, Jim spoke again, his voice low and reflective. "The wise men gave their greatest offerings, not out of obligation, but out of love and devotion. Maybe that makes us a kind of modern-day wise men." Delia looked at him tenderly. "Maybe it does. But I think we received something more valuable than gold, frankincense, or myrrh. We gave each other ourselves." Jim smiled and kissed her softly on the forehead. "And that will always be the greatest gift." The watch and the hair were no longer part of their lives, but what they had built together was stronger than any material object. The combs and the chain, though physically useless, had become symbols of a love that transcended the tangible, an eternal reminder that true wealth lies in what one is willing to give. And so, in a small apartment in a bustling city, surrounded by simplicity and warmth, Delia and Jim found the happiness that can only come from a pure and selfless love. Like the wise men, they had given the best of themselves, and in doing so, they had discovered the true meaning of Christmas.